Okay, so this is a continuation on feminism. Obviously, I had some technical difficulties right there. So I am going to kind of pick off where I left off. That the idea of theory plus praxis, of theory and action, then should remind you of conflict theory back in what feels like a million years ago, back in the beginning of the semester, right? That Marx argues that the whole point of, sociology, of doing any of this, is to cause change. So what feminists do is not just thinking, it's not just saying stuff, it's actually going and doing it, okay? And I find that most people then, when they say that list of things, generally, if you are against feminism, then you also think lesbianism is somehow wrong. What I say with both of those is that both of them are actually good things, that it's not bad to be a lesbian, and it is not bad to be a feminist either. And I would say in both cases, you need to see it as something positive to be able to have equal rights among everyone. Okay. So what happens is, even though people use the word feminist like it's just one entity, feminism is not monolithic. That is throughout history in the United States and kind of within the United States, because I could give you a global perspective, but we'll focus on American since it is intro to Soc. Most of you are familiar with the first wave of feminism. And in that one, you are looking at Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of them campaigning then and devoting their lives to securing women's rights to vote. Now, that wave was considered largely successful simply because we actually secured the right to vote with the in the 1920s. Okay? And then the world kind of made America focus on other things for a long period of time. When it was calm again and America could focus on kind of internal movements, then the second wave of feminism occurred in the 60s and 70s. And in this one, we actually credit a woman named Betty Friedan, who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, that pretty much changed people's understandings, or women's understandings, and actually put into words what they were feeling. And that is that in a capitalist society, that if you do want to achieve parity, and if you want to actually gain the ability in order to compete and etc., that women actually should then be able to pursue an education if that's the path that they want to go down, and to enter the labor market in order to make a living for themselves. Now, I think I've mentioned before that before the 70s, there's a lot of stuff that we actually don't know that women didn't have. At least young people, I find, are always kind of flabbergasted to find out this. So that as a woman then, you couldn't open a credit card without a man's signature, right? I think I talked about this, that you couldn't rent an apartment, you couldn't have a checking account, that there were all of these rights not accorded to women. Second wave feminist movement actually heavily campaigned for the right for us to go out into the labor force, make a living, to basically get an education in order to be better prepared to do that. And if you are competing in the capitalist labor market, you can't actually be pregnant all the time. So very heavily campaign for reproductive rights. Now, once again, largely successful, but as you found out earlier in this lecture, then not quite, because we still haven't achieved parity in terms of equal pay. Okay. Now, what happened with that wave of feminism is that even though it focused largely on the plight of white middle class women, it actually excluded the needs and the issues then that faced other types of women who weren't white or middle class. So women of color were excluded, poor women were excluded, lesbians were excluded, that the disabled, and we can just keep on going down this list of people who were not included into the second wave of feminism. So that brings us back around to this concept that you've heard since the beginning of the semester, and that is intersectionality, right? Now, if you remember, when I talked about intersectionality, it is always associated with a sociologist named Patricia Hill Collins. Throughout the semester, I've reiterated the dimensions of oppression in the matrix of oppression, and that is race, class, gender, and sexuality. Intersectionality, basically a concept that identifies how different categories of inequality interact to shape the lives and groups of groups and individuals. So even though Patricia Hill Collins actually came up with and coined the term matrix of oppression, the term intersectionality then actually coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. And remember, at the beginning of the semester I said this theory then unique because it was one then proposed and originated by Black female scholars. And what they argue at that time is that race or gender resulted in exclusionary categories. Now, it seems kind of obvious that race and gender are not either or. However, I will tell you, when I was younger, I was often presented with this question, well, what do you think matters more? The fact that you are Taiwanese American or the fact that you are female? And I would really sit there and look at them like, are you kidding me, right? Because you can't really separate the two. And the two of them actually combine together to create then a whole new set of problems that I face that maybe a white woman would not face or an Asian American male would not face. So what happens with this idea of exclusionary is that when mainstream America thought about woman as a category, they just assumed white woman. Then when mainstream America thought of blacks as a category, of black people as a category, it's usually assumed that they were male, right? So it was this idea that all women are white people, all black people are male. It's very simplistic in that argument, and if I put it bluntly like that, but we really do have to see how mainstream America conceptualizes these ideas, okay? What happens in that case? Well, if it is a either or, then women of color, specifically black women, then get excluded from the frameworks. So what intersectionality did was that you were looking at these ideas of multiple dimensions of status and identity actually create unique and idiosyncratic experiences for each individual, right? That as, you know, as a, and we always use by default, right, a straight white wealthy male as kind of our default, but we can also see then how that would interact if, say, the outcomes of someone who is a white middle class straight female, right, versus someone who is a Muslim American woman who is poor and a lesbian. And it may seem like I kind of went from one extreme to the other, but it is just saying that we have to consider all of these things as a whole. Okay? So people are like, well, then if everyone's different and everyone's individual and everyone's unique, how do we organize that? How are we going to actually have social activism if we're going to say everyone is different? Well, we can actually say that we all have this understanding of oppression, right? It is this idea that power then becomes the uniting factor. Not having power becomes the united factor, rather than saying, okay, each group should campaign for itself. It's saying we should all work together as a unit. That is the issues then facing, say, someone on the basis of religion, that if you are Muslim, and blessed Ramadan to those of you who are, then you can actually, even though it's completely different than being part of the GLBT community, the oppression is there, and that as oppressed people, we all kind of have to unite together in order to kind of change our society. And this is what people don't understand, is that men can be feminists too. That I actually know quite a few feminists who are white, straight, male, and wealthy. And so it doesn't mean that if you are a certain category, you cannot be a feminist. right? So feminism, pretty much for everyone, and something that will actually begin to untangle a lot of this mess created by patriarchy. And it seems like it's slow, and it has been really, really slow. But as someone who's been doing it for a very long time, teaching feminism for a very long time, I can say that it is actually reaching a broader and broader audience. We can actually see then some of the gains that were achieved, especially when it came to then the Me Too movement, which actually sought to identify and convict sexual assaulters. Huge guy in Hollywood, Harvey Weinstein, who was the producer who pretty much ruled Hollywood for most of the 90s, actually then just sent to life in prison for his activities in terms of sexual assault. So this is Gender. If you guys have any questions, then just send me an email, and hopefully you learned a lot from this one.